Coming up today, South Korea, the United States and Japan warn North Korea against launching a provocation as speculation mounts the regime is preparing a long-range rocket launch. North Korea accuses President Park Geun-hye of jeopardizing upcoming reunions for war-separated families by giving a speech critical of Pyongyang at the United Nations. Plus, the International Monetary Fund expresses concern over the rapid jump in corporate debt in emerging markets. Stay tuned for these stories and more. Hello to our viewers around the world. It's 6 a.m. on Wednesday, September 30th here in Seoul. Thanks for joining us. I'm Mark Broome. We start with that high-level meeting in New York. South Korea, the United States and Japan have warned North Korea against launching a provocation, stressing such a move would trigger further sanctions against the regime. South Korea's Foreign Minister Yoon Byung-se met with his US and Japanese counterparts John Kerry and Fumio Kishida on Tuesday on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly to discuss regional issues, including the North's possible long-range rocket launch on the upcoming 70th anniversary of the country's ruling party. Speaking to reporters after the meeting, Minister Yoon said the three sides shared a common position that the international community will take swift and stern action if Pyongyang forges ahead with the launch or any other provocation. Minister Yoon added that the UN Security Council has begun reviewing measures that would be stronger than before and much more detrimental to the North. Around 150,000 US troops would be needed to go into North Korea if the regime were to suddenly collapse. That's the assessment of the global policy think tank, the RAND Corporation. It says the forces would be needed to secure the North's stockpile of WMDs and nuclear bombs. RAND's latest report, released on Tuesday, says one of the biggest concerns would be the sudden indiscriminate use of WMD against Seoul. If a collapse were to suddenly happen. It also says large amounts of humanitarian aid will need to be delivered promptly throughout North Korea, and this would require advanced stockpiling and organization. The report also says coordination with other nations, especially China, would be necessary. North Korea has slammed President Park Geun-hye's speech to the UN, saying it was an atrocious confrontation. The North Korean Central News Agency reports that a spokesperson for Pyongyang's committee in charge of inter-Korean relations said the South Korean leader had once again criticized her own people. He added the speech could worsen already shaky relations between the two Koreas and put at risk reunions of families separated by the Korean War. Those reunions scheduled to be held toward the end of October. Now, during her address to the 70th UN General Assembly, President Park urged North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons and open up to the international community. And before wrapping up her four-day trip in the US, President Park Geun-hye made one last stop in New York for an exhibit on Korean culture and cuisine. Our Kim Ji-yeon tells us more.
President Park Geun-hye spent the last day of her U.S. trip promoting Korean culture. On a visit to an exhibition on Korean culture and cuisine at the Korean Cultural Service in New York, the president had the honor of adorning some of the items with new certifications. The plaques are a mark of authenticity and quality for cultural items. This is the first time a sitting Korean president has visited an overseas branch of the Korean Cultural Service since its establishment 36 years ago.
전 세계에 있는 한국 문화원이 이런 우리 5,000년 한국 문화의 매력을 알리고 또 대한민국 국가 브랜드들을 소개하고 그러는 문화 외교를 잘 해줬으면 합니다.
The president also met with more than a dozen so-called K-culture supporters who will help get the word out about Korean culture in the U.S. Among them was last year's Miss USA Nia Sanchez, who has a fourth-degree black belt in Taekwondo.
I have done Taekwondo for most of my life, so I've learned so much through Taekwondo about the Korean culture, about the strength, the respect, and the discipline of the Korean people.
Korea views the culture industry as a potential growth engine, and the government has recently stepped up its support. As part of efforts, it has designated the last Wednesday of every month as a Culture Day to provide the public with greater access to cultural events. Kim Jeon, Arirang News.
Staying in New York, U.S. President Barack Obama and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin clashed during their first face-to-face encounter in over 2 years at the UN. Their discussions included a host of diplomatic issues, but focused on the ongoing crisis in Syria. Shin Se-min reports.
Meeting one-on-one for the first time in 2 years, U.S. President Barack Obama and Russian President Vladimir Putin agreed that their armed forces should sit down for talks to avoid getting into conflict in Syria. Obama reiterated Washington's stance that a peace plan must not include a return to the status quo in Syria under the current President Bashar al-Assad. His comments come as Russia has been sending warplanes to bases in Syria. Speaking at a press conference after the talks, the Russian leader also told reporters that it had been a constructive and business-like meeting.
Today's talks also have shown that our American colleagues totally understand all the details there and, of course, influence the process.
He also said, however, the world needs to back Assad and his regime, saying that his military is the only viable option for defeating the Islamic State. Obama offered no immediate comments. The two leaders had earlier clashed publicly in their speeches to the world body. President Obama said the U.S. is prepared to work with Russia and Iran in resolving the Syrian civil war. But in a clear reference to Russia's support for the Syrian regime, Obama said there cannot be
so much carnage, a return to the pre-war status quo.
Later in his address, Putin shot back at Obama, saying foreign interference has resulted in the destruction of institutions, referring to the crisis in Libya and the Syrian civil war. The two leaders' views on the situation in Syria left little indication as to how the two world powers will work together to bring to an end to the crisis, which has left more than 250,000 dead and caused countless more to flee the violence. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
Now, troubled automaker Volkswagen is going to refit millions of its vehicles in the wake of the diesel emissions scandal. The company says owners of cars with the affected engines will be contacted in the coming weeks and months. Sources familiar with the process say it should be fairly simple and quick and either mean modifying the vehicle's software or changing some parts. Volkswagen has admitted that 11 million vehicles worldwide were fitted with these so-called cheat switches, which tricked testers into thinking the vehicles met environmental standards. Just under half of VW brand cars. There are also 2.1 million Audis, 1.8 million VW commercial vehicles, 1.2 million Skodas and 700,000 Seat vehicles. The International Monetary Fund has expressed concern over a sharp rise in corporate debt in emerging market economies. In its latest report, the IMF said non-financial firms across major developing countries quadrupled their borrowing over the last decade, from around $4 trillion in 2004 to well over $18 trillion last year. The average corporate debt to GDP ratio jumped 26 percentage points over the same period to 74%. China accounted for a major share, followed by Turkey, Chile, Brazil and India. South Korea saw the 9th highest increase in debt among 13 countries with expanded corporate debt. The IMF advised emerging markets to prepare for the eventual rise in interest rates in advanced economies, as their firms could struggle to meet higher borrowing costs. And the IMF is also expected to slash its global growth forecast for this year and next year, due largely to weakening commodity prices. Kwon So-ah reports.
The goal of 3.3% global economic growth this year seems to be fading away. That was the previous forecast made by the International Monetary Fund, but a new study released by the organization Monday seems to indicate a downward revision is coming soon. Weakening commodity prices are threatening countries that are highly reliant on the production and export of commodities, particularly metals and energy resources such as crude oil. According to the IMF's formula, a decline in commodity prices could cut commodity exporters' GDP by nearly 1 percentage point per year over the next 3 years, compared to the 3-year period from 2012 to 2014. Commodity prices surged for around a decade in the early 2000s due to high demand from emerging countries, but prices have been dropping sharply in recent years. Along with slowing growth in China, which doesn't appear like it'll improve anytime soon, the IMF is seeing the global economic recovery moving at a slower pace too. In an interview with French magazine Les Echos, IMF chief Christine Lagarde said a projection of 3.3% growth this year is, quote, no longer realistic. She added the same goes for the 3.8% projection for 2016, but that growth will hover above the 3% level. The IMF's flagship World Economic Outlook is to be published next week. A global revision could also impact Korea's growth forecast, as there are split opinions on whether it'll reach the 3% level as projected by the government or not, as the central bank suggests. Kwon-soa, Arirang News.
Now, Korean makeup brands have become extremely popular. In China, they recently overtook Japan to snatch the #2 spot in China's cosmetics market, and the K-beauty trend has even begun to spread to the Middle East. Won Ji-yeon reports.
Korean beauty products are beginning to take over China. According to the Korea International Trade Association, Korea exported more than $370 million worth of cosmetics to China in the first half of the year. That marks a 250% jump from a year ago. Korea now ranks second after France in China's cosmetics market, and this signals an opportunity for Korean brands despite the plummeting value of the Chinese currency.
The number of cosmetics users in China has now reached nearly 200 million, and we believe that around 500 million people in China will use beauty and skincare products in the long run.
Korea's biggest makeup brand, Amore Pacific, is now eyeing new markets in the Middle East and Latin America. The middle class is growing in those regions, raising demand for beauty products. Amore Pacific plans to open its first store in Dubai next year and expand to other megacities in South America in 2017. Won Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
Now, can maths solve corporate challenges or social problems? Mathematicians are receiving extra attention these days as they visit industries with solutions of their own. Eunice Kim reports.
Someone once implied solving a stubborn problem is preceded by not obsessing over it. And that's not the only answer embedded in Disney's box office hit Frozen, the first animation to pull in more than 10 million moviegoers in Korea. Mathematicians were behind the vivid computer graphics, calculating every minute detail to create arguably the most realistic animated snow.
How will snowflakes move in 0.1 or 2 seconds? Using algorithms to figure that out makes it more realistic than having it animated.
Math is also playing a key role in medicine, predicting the movements of cells injected with a drug, and in robotics, in the development of artificial intelligence. American mathematician James Simons is also a billionaire investor. Using the power of math, he figured out how to walk away with a 30% plus profit each year during the global financial crisis. Back here in Korea, industrial mathematics is being used to figure out how to best restructure household debt. Just one example of how math and other industries are cooperating in finding workable alternatives. The Industry Math Problem Hunter project has math professors from some 20 universities visit industries to help solve problems.
We hope the pool of problem hunters will grow with more mathematicians as the infrastructure is further developed.
And hopes are more math and creative solutions will pop out of textbooks to help solve real problems in today's society in the months and years to come. Eunice Kim, Arirang News.
Well, that's all we have for now. I'm Mark Broome. Thank you as always for watching. We'll be back throughout the day with more newscasts. Goodbye.